Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Pamela Petro is an American writer obsessed with a country she visited by chance. She first went to Wales as a graduate student in her early 20s. The place felt deeply familiar from the moment she arrived, as did the sense of longing that permeates its landscape and stories, both recent and ancient. The Welsh have a word for this acute presence of absence, an untranslatable term that captures the feeling of something left behind or taken away, irretrievably beyond place and time, but that forever saddens, motivates, and marks us. Petro explores this concept in the book we're talking about today, both in its original Welsh context and in the broader context of all of our lives. It's a feeling that resonates deeply with me, and I think you'll recognize it too. Pamela Petro is the author of The Long Field, Travels in an Old Tongue, and The Slow Breath of Stone. She's also a fellow at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, where she directs the Dylan Thomas Summer School in Creative Writing. We spoke about her obsession with Wales, the presence of absence, and how the sense of loss and longing drives creativity and invention. One quick note before we jump in. I just want to mention my recent book, A Sunny Place for Shady People. I'm not going to pitch you on it. Instead, I'll tell you what one of my favorite writers, Paul Theroux, said in a recent email, because I was so pleased to read it. He said, "I finished A Sunny Place, and I greatly admire it. As a destination to write an affectionate Durrellian tribute to, probably the worst choice on earth. As a subject for a book, absolutely great. I think whenever the subject of Malta arises, your book will be referenced. I was struck by how just about everyone in power seemed to have been involved in Daphne's murder. Your untangling the whole business was masterful and persuasive, and one ends with the impression that the entire island is cursed. Such wicked places produce rebellious, clear-sighted, singular people like Daphne, just a few pearls in all the grit, and good books like yours, because instead of fleeing, you stayed the course and wrote about it." Paul also praised the book in a recent New York Times article. You can find that online. A Sunny Place for Shady People is published by Trinity University Press in the US and in a new paperback edition by Mid-Sea Books in Malta. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Pamela Petro. Wales might strike listeners as a strange place to become obsessed with, at least for an American with no prior ties to the country. So what first took you there?
That is a fine question, Ryan. What took me there was a graduate degree, a master's degree at what was then St. David's University College in a tiny town of Lampeter. I had gone to Brown University and was just about to graduate, and I went to pick up a final paper and saw this hideous poster. It was the ugliest poster I'd ever seen. It was an embryo whose head was exploding and words and images were coming out. Oddly enough, I had put together my own undergraduate degree in word and image. And this was a master's degree at this university I'd never heard of, in a place I'd never thought about. But I thought, this is the natural extension of all I'd wanted to do. So I applied, took a year to work to make enough money, and then arrived in Wales with my parents. We'd done a tour around England and Scotland, and they dropped me off in Wales. And I spent the whole first day crying in the rain. That was it.
So you said in the book that your degree involved studying illuminated manuscripts and things like that. Mm-hmm. So how did you approach that? That was pretty interesting.
Oh, what a good question. Nobody else has asked me that question. The degree covered all word and image interaction from illuminated manuscripts to film, essentially. And the whole idea of this degree, which was called the Word and the Visual Imagination, came about because this college had what they then called the Old Library, and it was a place nobody had really attended to for years and years. And just maybe 2 years before I got there, someone opened the door again and said, "This place is full of 18th century first editions, 19th century aquatint travel portfolios, and medieval manuscripts." And when I got there, they were still in place but hadn't been insured. So my group of 9 others and me on the MA program were locked in the library for 1 week from 9 to 12 and 2 to 5 every day. The insurance company insisted we be locked in. Our tutor said, okay, anybody who has to go to the bathroom now, because we're not coming out. And we were able to delve into these things that hadn't been seen in years and years, that had been made 800 years ago. And it was a revelation. It was just, I learned about how they were made. I learned the iconography, medieval iconography. What I learned in that class still affects the way I see the world today, in that I think it really helped me think, not just in terms of imagery, but in terms of metaphor. Everything in those volumes stood for something else, the way the medieval mind works. And I tell people today, I have a medieval mind. And I think it's centered there. And what's really cool about this too is that from that point, the college built a purposely built, beautiful new library called the Roderick Bowen Library for special collections. And now on the Dylan Thomas Summer School that I direct in creative writing, I take students there every year, and we see the same manuscripts that I had to see under lock and key. And the librarian believes that the oils of your fingers keep the pages supple. So instead of seeing these things under glass or wearing white gloves, we touch them. The students get to touch them. And there's one that has it's a medieval woman placing her child on the back of a tame bear. And so many fingers have touched it over the centuries that it's almost worn away. And our students go and touch it too. And that's the connection.
That's pretty interesting. It's also an interesting lens on a place like Wales, which is so layered with stories. But you described Wales as the landscape of your soul. Could you give us your first impressions of the place? And what was it that first hooked you on it?
Well, like I said, I got there and I cried just because it was gray, it was wet, it was cold, it was October. But I soon settled in and made friends. So on the kind of daily level, I settled in. But this landscape of the soul, there were several things. I think it goes to the concept of Cynefin that I talk about in my book. Cynefin can mean the place on a mountain that a sheep teaches her lamb, this is your place, this is where you belong. But Cynefin can also, and it can mean that in terms of people too, this is your spot, your bro in Welsh. It can mean, again, feeling at home in a place you've never been before. And that's what happened to me. I talk about this in the book, that I had traveled through Europe. I'd been through England and Scotland with my parents on this just before they dropped me off. There was something about the Welsh landscape that matched an inner landscape I had always imagined. And that inner landscape gave me access in some way to the ground beneath my feet, to the way the world had been made. I could see in Wales, standing on a hilltop, how the hills folded into one another, how the river valley wound between them. I could see deep time in the landscape. And this is because there were very few trees, and the hills of Wales lent itself to this kind of topographical map. And so the kind of distant horizon view, almost treeless, plus the topography, made me feel like I was seeing the key on a map. And I say in a book, without that key, I didn't know my place in the world. I had grown up in New Jersey, which was, I had a lovely childhood, but New Jersey is full of houses and shopping malls and cloverleaf highways. And I never had a sense of where I belonged on the earth. I felt like I could fall off when I lived there. And in Wales, I had that sense of rootedness in time and space, and it put my world in perspective. Humans weren't everything. We were just a small part of a big story. And of course, I didn't see all this in a glance, but this sense, when I look back at my journal from when I was 23 and first in Wales, I'm groping at describing all this. And it took me years and years to be able to articulate it in the long field. But that's all of that was something that I felt and experienced and got angry because I couldn't explain, but it was there. Emotionally, it really touched me.
Why do you think certain places have that effect? Like it's a little bit like Lawrence Durrell's concept of the spirit of place, where a certain landscape or a place really resonates with you, like nowhere else does, and it's the place where you feel most at home, and do your best work. But this is a little bit different than that, a little bit deeper. It's almost like an ancestral tie deep in your DNA without being ancestral. Why do you think certain places resonate that way? It's different for everybody.
It is different for everybody. I always thought my place would be France. I grew up learning French and wanting to go to France, and I did go my junior year abroad. And I loved it. I loved it. And I met my partner there. But France felt satisfied with itself in a way that it was seamless. There was no way in for me. Wales had an equally long, if not longer, history, but in addition to the sense of the landscape, there was more to it than that. I think we find analogs in some way for ourselves in places through the landscape, through the topography, but also through the history, the language. There's a real sense of marginality in Wales. You know that you're in the place that within the UK is the last rung of the ladder. When you're crossing the border between England and Wales on a road, a small B road that doesn't announce, "Welcome to Wales, Croeso I Gymru," you know you've crossed the border because, well, the hills get taller, but the houses get less pretty. The garden, there's no time or energy or money to create pretty gardens and pretty homes. It's poorer. And you can see that. And this sense of, I slowly learned about the history of Wales and how it was really the first colony of the English Empire under Edward I, back starting in 1282. All that is still present in Wales. And growing up in the States at a time dominated by the Vietnam War, by Watergate, I had this sense of the margin being the place where I felt at home because the centrality was in some way corrupted. It was, I was leery of it. And that had been impressed upon my generation. And then personally, I thought, maybe I'm gay. Maybe, I'm not sure about this. But that sense of marginality as well resonated. And the language that had been oppressed for so long, yet hung on, was a kind of, I guess, beacon of hope. So all of this combined for me to create, to chime with this place. But as you say, we have different places. So I think there was this one level that you say is almost kind of a DNA level of a visceral animal response to the landscape. But on top of that, it was personal, historical. There are these other determinants as well.
You mentioned the language just there. This is a good time to say something about the language. Why did you go to so much trouble to learn a language so few people understand? And could you give us a sense of some of the challenges involved?
Yeah. You say learn, that you're still learning, let's say. um, the story I tell in the book, and it's humiliating, but it's worth repeating, is that after a couple months of being on the MA program, I was at a pub in the village right next to Lampeter, which is where the college is, the town of Lampeter. And somebody talked about a fair that was going to happen in Llanbedr Pont Steffan. And I said, where is Llanbedr Pont Steffan? And everybody erupted laughing. And I was humiliated. And Llanbedr Pont Steffan is Lampeter. So Lampeter is an anglicized proper name that doesn't have meaning. Llanbedr, well, it doesn't really have meaning. Llanbedr is Peter's church in Welsh. Pont Steffan is Stephen's Bridge. So this is a place, this name gives a picture of the past. It's like a snapshot of Peter's church at Stephen's Bridge. Stephen is the Norman knight who came over with William the Conqueror, who was given this tract of Wales as a prize, whose Motte and Bailey Castle was built on what's now the college grounds. And you can look out of the quadrangle building on the castle, and the Motte is still right next to it, the mound. So there's a whole world here that doesn't exist in the anglicized version of itself. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're ghosts in the names of all of these towns. And Llanfair is Mary's church. Llan means sacred space or church, has come to mean church. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to know this place that I was really beginning to love. I needed to learn its language in order to dig a little deeper. And the quality of the stories I was learning, we can talk about that later, but they were so particular. A story like Jack and the Beanstalk in English has taken over the globe, and the story has bled around the globe. Jack's Beanstalk could grow anywhere, but a similar story, a wonder tale set in Wales, is still located. It names the town where that took place, and you can go there and you can experience that landscape as you could 1,500 years ago. It's still there, and that sense of depth of story and myth in landscape is the key to unlocking that is language. So I wanted to get closer to that too. But the challenge of it, my God, Welsh is diabolical. It has, and any language is hard to learn. Add a mutation system where the first letters of the language change in different circumstances. Prepositions that conjugate, which is, like, who came up with that? Why is that necessary? And then the fact that it's a minority language. Say 20% of Welsh people speak Welsh now. So to learn a language in a country where you share the majority language with everyone is really hard, especially if you're not, I was pliable, let's say. I wasn't so determined that when someone said, look, we only have 15 minutes and we need to catch up, let's speak English, I would always speak English. And that's what led to my first book about Wales, Travels in an Old Tongue, because I thought, what if I take Welsh out of Wales and practice it in these different places around the world? Then I'm much more invested in speaking Welsh, especially when you get to a place like Japan, where you're speaking with, say, a group of academics who don't speak English. And this is the only language you have in common is Welsh. So after that trip, I spoke the best Welsh I've ever spoken.
That's a brilliant idea for a trip and a book too. I mean, and it's astonishing where you found Welsh speakers. Like any listeners to this podcast would probably know that there's Welsh speakers in Patagonia, thanks to Bruce Chatwin's book in Patagonia. But why Japan? That really surprised me.
Well, this was just before the internet took off, right? So all of this research was done by word of mouth, by there used to be a publication, I've forgotten the name of it, that was for Welsh expats, and I got their they shared, thank goodness, their subscriber list with me. So it was a long time in planning this. But there were Welsh societies all throughout Western Europe, so I could access those pretty easily. And then also in Thailand, Singapore, there's one in Kuala Lumpur, but I never got there. A typhoon kept me away from Hong Kong. Wanted to go there. And Japan had a really active St. David's Society, and primarily made up with expats and Japanese professors who, to teach English in Japan, I believe at the time, you needed to also be able to teach another indigenous language of the British Isles. And the healthiest language is Welsh. So some of them had learned Welsh. They'd learned it academically, but some really wanted to speak it. And I remember one night I was at a beachside house. The typhoon was coming. The house was shaking. Rain and wind gusts were just smacking it. And I was sitting around with a group of Japanese people, and we were all speaking Welsh, was mapping a town on a chalkboard, and it was Lampeter. And I said, I recognize that. What?
That's bizarre.
What kind of connection to come halfway around the world to see Lampeter depicted in a typhoon in Japan?
There's a Welsh society here too of some kind. I have a Welsh barber here in Berlin, and he arrived here around the same time I did, and he's been going to that. He said he attended a couple times and tried to start learning some Welsh.
I love it. And this is the thing with expats. You become, so all of them said to me, I never thought of myself as particularly Welsh in Wales. But as soon as you go outside Wales, of course, you become someone who bakes Welsh cakes and wears dragon T-shirts and tries to learn Welsh.
That's really true. Like I draw the line at watching hockey. I've never been interested in ice hockey, but I did learn to bake pumpkin pies since we moved abroad. So I felt so American as when I step outside the country. Like you just become a cartoon character of yourself. That's true. So one particular Welsh word is at the center of your book. And it's such an interesting concept, and you explore this in a lot of depth. And I'd like to look at it from a few angles. So what is hiraeth?
Hiraeth. It's a nice pronunciation, by the way.
Oh, I just took a random crack based on what you wrote in the book.
Hiraeth. It's a fascinating word. And I'll say just the etymology. Hir is long. Eith is the past participle of to go. So the most often cited definition of hiraeth is long gone. It also can mean hir, long, eith, field, the long field. And that's the name of my book. Hiraeth, as you say, it's one of those things. It's like trying to catch a dot of mercury. You touch it and it squirts out because it has so many personal meanings. But essentially, to me, it's a name given to the presence of absence, that awareness that something is missing, something is incomplete in the present moment. And that something could be a place you've left behind, a home, a place you felt at home. And you might have felt at home because of a landscape or a community of people, a family, a dream that you once held that made you feel like you were you, that you've in some way outlived or outgrown. All of those things are ways of feeling at home that you, in a sense that you no longer experience. And hiraeth is the word for that. Very simply, it's being out of your home place But that home, it's home that has all the different definitions. Hiraeth, when you look at it that way, is a simple concept that you miss and long for that thing, that home place that you no longer can access. But home itself is very complex. It can also mean, looking in the other direction, a future that you can't ever quite touch, that always recedes before you. What's Tennyson's Ulysses? The arc of the untraveled world that fades forever and forever when I move, or something like that. In the 19th century, I think Hiraeth in Wales, the incarnation of that, was based in Calvinist Methodism, the sense of wanting to have a personal savior in Christ, and never being able to experience that. You could never meet Christ in this life. And Hiraeth was defined in a very particular religious sense. And there's some searing hymns about that longing for Jesus, almost in a physical way, by people like Anne Griffith, who I write about in the book. So Hiraeth has a lot of different aspects to it. For me, particularly, once I felt Cynefin, this sense of incredibly deep connection to this place I'd never been before, but knew in my heart and soul I wasn't of this place, and I would have to go back home. I started to feel Hiraeth before I even knew the word. I knew I'd have to leave. And I got home, and my family memorably called it Pam's Welsh thing. Like, when is Pam going to get over the Welsh thing? Which I never did. But can I say one more thing about it?
Sure, yeah.
What's fascinating to me is when I started writing this book, it came from a very personal place that I felt very deeply. And I started talking to all my Welsh friends, and their response was, "Oh, no, not Hiraeth again." Hiraeth, you can go in a tourist shop, and there's Hiraeth written on coffee mugs and little samplers and pillows, and they see it as something that's become commercialized and kitschy, and also dangerous in that it's backward looking. They think that it's this sense of Wales as having a history that has been and never was. The longing for to run the clock backward to 1282 and not become a colony of England, and all that could have been, the glory of Wales that would have been. And that longing has inspired a lot of stuff, a lot of interesting things, but they feel that it's impotent, and we should really concentrate on Wales in the future. And I see all that, and I've said to them, yes, I see that. That makes good sense to me. But as an ever optimistic American, I want you to see my side of it, which is that Hiraeth really sparks this incredibly creative response. That where there's loss, there's longing. And where there's longing, there's this very human instinct to fill in the long field. If you can't have something, you make something up, you compensate. And those creative compensations are the hymns. They're the stories of the Mabinogion, the wonder tales out of the early Middle Ages and beyond. They're the daydreams of someone like Iolo Morganwg, who created a whole other world that he invented and passed off as the real thing of Druid mythology, which wasn't real, but was fantastically inventive. So I think this engine of creativity that emerges from Hiraeth is what sits at the heart of Welsh culture. And really, as I said in the book, all creativity, we're we're always responding to something that's not there, that we feel needs to be there when we create something. So there's hiraeth is a creative spark as well as it can be a destructive cause for just impotent longing. Depends on how you take it.
I think my favorite, you give many definitions of this in the book and trying to get at this concept from different angles. I think my favorite one, you say, Hiraeth is contraband from the wars we always lose, wars against mortality, time, and injustice. That's really nice. When reading that, I realized that the music that hooked me most as a teenager transmitted that exact feeling. It kind of called it up through a combination of layered music and mysterious poetic lyrics, and it felt as though the person who wrote that he understood that feeling too, and I can immediately sense, and that's what it was really. And that's still my favorite band to
What
this
was
day.
it?
Oh, it's an Australian band called The Church, the '80s
Oh, wow.
band, and yeah, somehow their music captures exactly that feeling, and it's a feeling that I've always had a sense for as well, I think. And we should say that this is different from nostalgia too. You say you differentiate this from sort of garden variety
Yeah.
nostalgia in the book, and also from the Portuguese idea of what saudade, solitude, or maybe you
Yes.
should, yeah. So tell us how that's different than from these two
Well,
concepts.
actually, hiraeth and saudade, I have my partner's Brazilian, so I say it the Brazilian way. Um, they are the only two cognates that are supposedly that supposedly mean exactly the same thing. Linguistically, I don't know. I'm not a linguist, but there are a lot of other words that come close. But I see nostalgia as, I mean, we're nostalgic for everything. I'm writing about Cape Cod right now, and I have a nostalgia, yeah, for um, going there as a child with my parents, my family, and my brothers. Um, but nostalgia can easily be created. Um, it can become very sentimental, and the goal of nostalgia, I think, is to inspire certain sort of warm, fuzzy feeling in you. Whereas hiraeth, to me, my definition of it is this presence of absence, which is both, you're looking into an abyss it's not there. This is something that will never be there. Um, and that is both terrifying and deeply saddening, but it does spark these responses um, that are both creative and brave and kind of wonderful. Um, so I think hiraeth is just a much deeper, more layered look back or look forward. Well, nostalgia never looks forward. There's another difference. Um, but to go back to Saudade, what's interesting about that to me, and I don't know, it's just something I've thought of. I haven't made a whole lot about it, but if you think of the map of Western Europe, Wales and Portugal, two small nations on the western rim of Europe, hard up against the Atlantic Ocean on one side, and a much larger, more powerful neighbor on the other, um, that has at times um, treated them as colonies. And they both seafaring, both experienced loss. Um, Saudade is often linked to the time of Portuguese exploration when people left and rarely came back. So there was saudade on the part of the people who left and saudade on the part of the people who stayed home. And now, looking back at that heroic time that's passed, and Wales has that too. We look back on a heroic past of has been and never was, of Celtic warriors and um, resistance. King Arthur. I mean, it all is summed up in King Arthur. But there's that similarity between Portugal and Wales really interests me, and to have both have created these two words that are so similar and express the presence of absence.
Yeah, that's interesting too. That the history of exploration in Portugal and going outwards, Wales has that in a similar sense, like Ireland does. It was a place where often people emigrated from and didn't come back, and
Yep.
families were scattered across the globe. So there's that similarity as well.
Yeah, that's right. And you talked about Patagonia before, and that was maybe the biggest en masse emigration from Wales to Patagonia in the 19th century. But what was I going to say? Oh, it was Arthur. Just Arthur is such a great example of the once and future king. And I think that concept really sums up Hiraeth of, you know, Arthur existed in the past as the great Welsh hero, British hero fighting the Angles or the Saxons. Um, and he supposedly is sleeping right on Avalon, waiting to come back and help the Welsh in their time of greatest need, but not right now. He's of the past and of the future, but never the present. And that is a wonderfully temporal way of understanding Hiraeth.
Yeah, I really like that part of the book where you talked about some Arthur and the once and future king and how that whole concept applies to this feeling. It's interesting too that Arthur, in a sense, became your symbol too, in that leaving Wales after your first stay there, it became sort of your once and future home, the place that
Yep.
you that shimmered just over the hill that you always sort of pined for, but it wasn't in the present, and it was a place that you ultimately couldn't end up settling there, but you would always kind of go back to. So that
Go back to. Yeah, I mean that's if and I, I used to think, oh my, I should have lived there, I should have moved there. I couldn't for many reasons, and my partner has tenure at Smith College and health insurance and all that. So we live here. But if I had, I never would have written The Long Field because I wouldn't have experienced Hiraeth in that way of the place that I felt I flourished best. And I talk about this in the book. There's a midpoint where I climb Mount Snowdon in the book. And before that, I try to establish Hiraeth, I think it's Robin Chapman, a Welsh linguist, says it's both something that's uniquely Welsh and at once a universal human experience. And so the first part of the book is establishing Hiraeth as this Welsh um, concept that's embedded in its landscape and its history and its national experience. And the second half opens the book up more to human experiences with the loss of parents and experience with technology and all kinds of things. But that middle chapter where I climb Mount Snowdon is where I finally understand that Hiraeth is something that put me in the place of an emigrant or an exile. That my partner Marguerite is both Brazilian and American, and she grew up in this middle space, this long field, and was never comfortable in the States and never comfortable in Brazil. She could never be enough of one or the other. Her Portuguese was never perfect. Her English was never perfect. Now she's really happy to have two cultures and this, what Edward Said called a contrapuntal view of the exile, that you see from more than one perspective and you gain more empathy and understanding that way. I grew up in New Jersey. I was fully embedded in America. I had a German ancestry on one side and a Hungarian one on the other, but there were no real um, touchstones left on either side. And I instinctively sought to put myself to find another place so that I had one place where I felt at home and the other was my home in the sense of my address. And that created that sort of contrapuntal view for me. And it created my life as an experience of Hiraeth, as an emblem of Hiraeth, longing always for one or the other. And that's where I think that's what created my empathy and understanding, and is the it's the difficult place to be. It's an uncomfortable place, but it's the creative place. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's really true. I could relate to that sense of Wales having become like a symbolic place or a once and future king in the way that Arthur had. Mongolia was that place for me for a little while. Um, like
No kidding.
I did a trip I was living in Japan for a couple of years, and before I turned 30, I quit my job and bought a one-way ticket to Mongolia because I didn't want to turn 30 at this school. And I traveled there and through the huge chunks of China for several months, Tibet in the West, uh, and then into Southeast Asia. But at some point in the journey, I received a message that my father was quite ill, and I had to go back to Canada. And I kind of got trapped there for 2 or 3 years at least, maybe more, in these horrible dead end temp jobs in Ottawa. Like they're just I was unemployable, and it was just the envelope stuffing and like the worst shit work for terrible pay.
Sorry.
But I
It's
had this
soul killing.
well, I had this metal ring that I bought in a market in Lhasa, of the kind that would stain your finger green, like this really cheap trinket. But I wore that all the time to this job, and I remember I would look at it and I would remember that once, before I had lived this other way, and it wasn't that I missed Mongolia in particular,
No,
or
it was the
although I
person
would
that
like to go back to it, but it's the person that I was, and I wanted to remind myself that of the person I
you
used
could
to
be
be.
that
And
person. You were
right,
that person. And you were
yeah,
somebody who could buy a ring at a market in Mongolia and put yourself in that place that was totally unfamiliar and different to you, but exhilarating, right?
mm,
Uncomfortable, but exhilarating being there. And that's exactly it. I've done that. I've sat at meetings and looked down at a ring that I bought in Wales and thought, okay, I'm somebody who can go there and speak this language and be in this other place. And it's another self of mine.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. That symbolism of the once and future, but maybe not right now, not at this
but
moment.
not right
That's
now.
really powerful. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you mentioned too that about how these stories are encoded in the Welsh landscape and the Welsh language, and uh, a sense of absence is at the heart of the culture. Wales is a place where the landscape contains loss. So we should say something about that as well, because that seems to
Oh,
be a part of the root of this concept.
great question. You have such good questions. I love it. I love it. I can illustrate that with a story, one of my favorite stories. Um, so the Mabinogion, which I've talked about before, is a collection of wonder tales. Um, the first four are a cycle of the Mabinogi, and it's they are probably filtered down from Celtic gods and goddesses at the adventures of these deities before history, before we started writing things down. Um, the Mabinogion was first collected as a compilation, not all the stories, but the first four. Um, in the 12th century, in a manuscript that at the time when that manuscript was written, they were already old. They were bits, and they don't make sense, some of them. And because they're bits and pieces collected by different oral storytellers and jumbled together, so you can tell you're looking at sparks of light that somehow created an arc once, but now almost do. So they have that sense of real antiquity about them. And there's one, and it's the story of Manawyddan, who takes three of his friends, and they're at court in a place called Arberth in South Wales. It's now Narberth is the English name, and it's off the A40. You go to Carmarthen, you go south, you take a left, you're on the A40. 10 minutes down the road, there's a sign for Narberth, and you can go to the ruins of Narberth Castle. And that's where they went. And they went to sit on the magic mound. And the mound is still there. It's probably it's part of an earthwork that belonged to a Neolithic fort. They've done some archaeology on it. And it's just outside the ruins of this castle. And when they sat there, they waited for wounds or marvels. And I say in the book, sometimes it's hard to tell wounds and marvels apart. But as they sit there, there's a thunderclap and lightning and mist falls, a heavy mist. And when it lifts, everything is gone. Everything that they ever knew is gone, vanished. Their animals, the court, any people they knew, the crops, everything, and they alone remain. And to me, that is the story of existential loss. It's all distilled down. These stories were being formulated during this time of incredible conflict between newcomers to Britain, the tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, Germanic tribes coming out of Europe, and the original Britons, wherever they came from, who spoke Proto-Welsh and early Welsh. And they were all over the island. I mean, British was spoken pretty much everywhere. But as the thunder clapped, right, and the lightning struck, when the mist lifted, the Anglo-Saxons were on the English side of the island. The Welsh were on the western side. And there was this sense of incredible loss, I think. In the book, I take apart the word landscape, the land being the geography beneath your feet, the scape meaning a related sense of everything that makes a home, a language, build architecture, agriculture. And that's the scape. That's everything that was missing when the mist lifted from Manawydan and his friends. And to me, that's the kernel of Hiraeth. It's the symbolic moment in these ancient wonder tales that represent nations coming into being, and one had more power and more land than the other, and it occupied a place that was much easier to raise animals and grow crops. The lowlands, the sort of verdant lowlands of England versus the hills of Wales. And this is probably the point. And so that story, you can go and sit on that mound like I do in the book and remember that story. And you can go right there. And there's a sense of being connected, like whoosh, back in time to this moment. This is probably where I should say that we keep using the word Wales, and Wales is an Anglo-Saxon word, a Saxon word, meaning the place of the Romanized others. Because this came at a time, of course, the Romans had invaded Britain and were there for 400 years, whatever. So Romanized in the sense of they were part of the Roman Empire. But the others, the home of the others. And that's the word that the world knows Wales by. It calls itself Cymru. Cymru meaning home of us, home of fellow countrymen. So we're referring to Wales through the eyes of the people who wrote the history, not for the people who were colonized. And I have to say, go Wales, because Wales right now is taking back the ownership of the national parks in the sense of changing the names. The Brecon Beacons National Park, my favorite in sort of southeast Wales, is now the Bainau Brecaniog National Park. So there's a sense of we're going to tell our own story now.
This is also something that you do in the book. You tell the story of these places and Hiraeth in its original context, but you also tell it through you explore it through the context of your own life, through various elements of memoir. So why did you feel it was important to include memoir in the book? Was it to broaden the concept or to make it more relevant to current readers?
That's another great question. I This is the story of how to sell the book. When I started writing the book, I wanted it to be a kind of classic travel book where I was a disappearing presence, and I was going to talk about Wales and Welsh history and introduce North Americans, to this idea of hiraeth that I thought was very applicable to the US and Canada. I mean, we experience hiraeth all the time. This is the hiraeth of the Native Americans and Native Canadians, the indigenous people whose land was literally taken away, and of the people who came who feel like they have a deeper home somewhere else. You meet people and say, "Where are you from?" They'll say Massachusetts, and then they'll say, but where are you really from? Like, what's your ancestry?" So hiraeth is something that we need too. And I set out to do that. And I started sending the book out and giving it to friends to read. And the friends were nicer than the agents who said, "Nope, you're trying to write a book about an idea about a place that nobody's heard of. We're not interested." And one agent said, "Try including memoir." And I did, thinking that she meant about the time I lived in Wales when I was on the master's program. And she read it and wrote back simply, "I cannot be your agent." That hurt. That really hurt. That was like being gutted. And slowly I began to realize I don't need to tell the story of me in Wales. My understanding of hiraeth is as something very Welsh and also a universal human emotion. I am absent as a human from a book about absence. And I realized that, and it was like getting hit in the head with a brick. And I thought, I need to be the channel here for universal experiences of hiraeth. And so, I talk about the hiraeth of dementia, of my mom forgetting herself. Maybe the most painful long field that opens up when the mind forgets its own memories. And my dad too, and I relate them to the megaliths, how in just one generation, our parents keep from us certain stories they don't want us to know that we'll never know. And in my dad's case, it was his real heroism in the war that he couldn't talk about because his ship being blown up just before D-Day. And it was too painful. And he finally, after a stroke, began to tell little bits of this story. And I would think, what's locked in you that I can never access? And the megaliths have the stories locked in them that we can never access. And instead of just one generation, it's hundreds of generations. But the Neolithic people went to enormous trouble and grief and loss to put up these standing stones and create these dolmens. And the stones remain, but the intent is gone. We don't know why. So there's this built landscape of hiraeth to me in Wales that really resonated right from the beginning. And I knew I wanted to include that, but I didn't know how to make it relevant to readers. And as once I'd had this revelation of I'm absent from this book, I painfully worked myself into it and saw the connection. Once I started writing about the megaliths, I saw the connection to my parents and that loss, and how language, in another chapter, the loss of Welsh, of people, of the 80% of English speakers in Wales who don't speak their native language, and of the Welsh speakers whose language is has a minority status in its own country. It goes both ways. That hiraeth is a double-edged sword linguistically. I realized I'm still not a very good Welsh speaker, but I could relate to that as a gay woman, practicing a minority way of loving in a relationship. And so I linked language and sexuality in another chapter. And there's a chapter about the hiraeth of technology, how we harness electricity and the power of banishing night, and then we long for the stars. With every step forward, we create an absence that we didn't anticipate. So these are some of the more universal stories that I felt I had to be the touchstone for. So people would read it and say, "Oh yes, I feel that too," or I have a parent who had dementia as well, or I know what she's talking about. So painfully, I had to insert myself in the book, and that was a process of excavation over and over, going deeper and deeper until the book is the most personal thing I've ever written.
I think one of my favorite examples was digital hiraeth. That one really resonated with me. The feeling of a sense of longing for a time before the internet, for what we've lost. And anybody from our gender, I bang on about this all the time with regard to travel, how much it's changed since the internet came along. I find it even difficult to relate to younger people sometimes whose lives don't straddle that fault line.
Absolutely.
Who don't remember what that world was like.
That's the digital pilgrims chapter. Yeah.
Yeah.
The longing for absence itself, the absence of absence, that everything is always available. There's no real memory. You think, oh, what did my dad look like? And I think I say in the book, I can stare in the mirror and sort of reassemble his face from mine, or I can just go and click on a picture and pull it up. But what's more important? Where is the connection truer and deeper? It's not in the snapshot that comes up to my computer instantly. So yeah, I think digital pilgrims, I've had a couple people say that really resonated with them.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. So I want to bring things to a close by making this personal for everyone. And I think there's an example that I think we can all relate to in your book. You write, "Ultimately, we're all exiles. Everyone who rises to adulthood feels a pang of hiraeth, now and again, for their quintessential starting place, the universal home of childhood innocence, from which we are all unquestionably expelled."
That's that brings it down to the bottom line. Because, you can have all kinds of different childhoods. They're happy, they're traumatic, whatever. But we see the world a certain way as a child. And that is unique to us, I think. And we can remember that, but we can't experience that, the totality of that, looking through those eyes of a child ever again. And I think James Joyce said, "My childhood bends beside me and I turn to consult it." We can consult our childhoods, and some of us more so than others. And that's wonderful that some of us have the ability to do that, but we can't ever be that child. So yeah, that's what links us all. And that's hiraeth. That's what we feel hiraeth for, all of us. So yeah, that's a perfect close. I love that you highlighted that.
Well, thank you for your time today, Pam. I really enjoyed your book, and I hope my listeners will pick up a copy of The Long Field too.
Ryan, thank you so much. I think these have been some of the most interesting, probing questions I've had, and I just appreciate it. And I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.